Okay, my English teacher friend. So I have a fascinating writing workshop today for you. And basically, it stems from this. So, teachers have asked me often how my students get to such good, rich, pithy reads of poetry and short stories. And I tell them this, I've been teaching AP Lit and AP Lang for over 20 years. And with AP Literature in particular, I think that the College Board has a penchant for students that can crush new critical and deconstructive reads. So I get into a lot of critical theory with my students early in the academic year. So what I want to do in this writing workshop is give you a little, brief overview of how I establish those reads, how I ground them, but then a really magical exercise that I do with students that really helps things click. So I'm a child of the 80s and the 90s, and I'm a lyric guy. And I've always been really amazed by the fact that so many 1980s lyrics that were huge, huge hits and made millions of dollars, they make no sense. The lyrics make no sense. So what I'm going to do in my writing workshop right now is show you how to do new critical and deconstructive reads of nonsense lyrics, but then how to write the papers as if the students were doing like an FRQ1 or an FRQ2 on the lit exam using my templates. So yet again, I'll Bob Ross my instruction for you. And we'll pull the strings of my inverted thesis for the introductions, and then we'll construct the body paragraph syllogistically. And my two songs that I'm going to feature are Boy George and Culture Club's Karma Chameleon, and then that wacky song called Safety Dance, Men Without Hats. So those are the two that I'm going to be featuring, and I'll get to those in just a second. I have some prefatory stuff to get through. So, as I've already alluded to, I think that when students are posed the prompts and the questions, like the heart of FRQ1 and FRQ2, they're being asked two questions. What is the authorial intent and how does the author construct meaning? Those questions are at the heart of literary analysis. And I think that in order for students to really get at the gist of those questions, they really need to do new critical and deconstructive reads for the most part. And what I see in anchor papers is most students approach FRQ1 and FRQ2 with a reader response critical lens, and that's what yields so much of the plot summary, the plot analysis that we see in anchor papers or even in our own students' writing. So I'm all about the new criticism and deconstruction. In order to teach my students these basic fundamental concepts, I equip them with a book called Text in Context by Stephen Lin. It's he's got a number of editions, and at my district we have the fourth edition, which is getting to be a little outdated, but it's still nonetheless really good. And he does a wonderful job of really synthesizing and streamlining these concepts in a way that's accessible for high school students. I remember in graduate school and even as an undergraduate taking critical theory for a whole semester and getting into the minutia of it and the theory and the technique, which for an AP exam students don't necessarily need to go to that level of depth. So, all the way, new criticism and deconstruction. I think that the College Board definitely gives our kids two thumbs up when they're able to perform these types of reads and then, have it executed in their writing as well. So let's just go over a few of the assumptions and the practices and the questions of new criticism and deconstruction. So I took these right from Stephen Lin. So the assumptions of new criticism is that the work itself should be your focus, not the author's intention, not the reader's response. So we get out of students passing sort of passive judgment, side by commentary that they often do, which is anchored in reader response. So more of a focus on the work itself. So the purpose of your focus is to explain the work's organic unity, how every feature, large and small, contributes to its meaning. And the last one, great literary works are marked by some kind of complexity as levels of meaning, oppositions, tensions, ironies, ambiguities are unified. So this is why you see my students, especially in literature, talk so much about juxtapositions, binaries, and dichotomies. So this is rooted in this discipline and this read. And oftentimes when you look at my student samples, when I do writing workshops, my students are going for those types of reads. So in terms of the practices of new criticism, you read closely. You can assume that everything is carefully calculated to contribute to the work's unity, figures of speech, point of view, diction, recurrent ideas or events, etc. I always tell my students that nothing is haphazard. We're reading some really good authors, and you got to get into intentionality. So we were doing a James Baldwin piece the other day and noticed that he misused a semicolon. I'm like, guys, James Baldwin knows how to manipulate, colons and semicolons and avoid comma splices. Why did he do that? There's an intention there, and it opened up a whole rich reading for us. And that's kind of a new critical component. So you got to find those oppositions, those tensions, those ambiguities and ironies in the work. And I always find, especially at the college board level, at the AP level, students have a hard time reading for ironies and paradoxes. So we do a lot of practice with that. And it often is featured in FRQ1 and FRQ2. And my students seem to do fine once May rolls around after having me for an academic year. And then you indicate how all these various elements are unified. What idea holds them together? So this idea that when you analyze a text, you don't want to go one paragraph tone, one paragraph syntax, one paragraph diction. There's no unity in that. And it's a very simplistic way of writing. So to begin to see how the pieces kind of jigsaw intersect with each other and create meaning as a whole. So like, for example, how might a syntactical maneuver create a whole tone shift, right? Link the tone and the syntax together. Our students need to be able to do that. And some of the simplistic ways of reader response don't yield that type of complexity. So the questions that are posed in new criticism are as follows. What formal elements does this work have? The structure, the imagery, the diction, etc. How can these formal elements be arranged in opposing pairs or groups? And then lastly, kind of going back to what we were just talking about, what unifying idea holds these opposing elements together? Think in terms of an although XY thesis sentence. And you'll see in a second here when we get into analyzing the songs and writing the essay about the songs, my template of the syllogistic method is a structure of although XY. That's kind of what a syllogism is. So the template really supports these new critical and deconstructive reads as well. So let's switch gears and take a look at deconstruction and do the same: assumptions, practices, and questions. So deconstruction, meaning is made by binary oppositions, and it's just that idea that we have duality in our life, right? We can't understand something unless we understand and ascertain its opposite. So we can only know happy if we know sad, man, woman, black, white. So everything has a binary opposite, everything has a binary relationship. And the idea in this discipline is that one item is favored over the other. This favoring can be reversed and questioned by imaginative and playful reading. So we'll definitely do that with our nonsense lyrics. So you got to make meaning out of those things, but stay within the context of the song, within the context of the lyrics. And then such reversals and questionings undermine dogmatic thinking, opening up new ideas, suggesting that meaning is ultimately unstable and open-ended. But in saying that, there's a caveat. A lot of my students come to me and they say, well, my teacher last year said, if I could support my interpretation with the text, then I'm right. And I'm like, no. So, let's say, for example, we're talking about, the FRQ2 from the 2022 exam, Richard Blanco shaving, and you say it's a metaphor for a Marxist revolution. You're wrong, right? I'm sure I could write a whole paper about that and support it with the text, but it's a misinterpretation of the text. There is an intent, right? There is authorial intent. and in the creation of the meaning through the diction, and you have to stay within the context of the piece. So in terms of practices, identify the oppositions in the text and determine which items are favored. Identify what happens to be central to the text and what appears to be marginal and excluded. Reverse the text hierarchy, the system of favoring, open up another reading, and or argue what appears to be marginal is actually central. And we're going to do that with Karma Chameleon and the safety dance all day long. It's very easy to do this once students have enough practice and have seen it enough times. And then the questions, very similar to new criticism. What does the text most obviously seem to say? So you get into universal themes, universal truths, authorial intent. How can the text be turned against itself, making it say the opposite of what it most obviously seems to say? I know from experience, from having read for the College Board, they love it when kids can do this. They love it when students can pull this off successfully. And I think it bodes well when students can read this way and then manipulate the templates, sophistication point all day long. How can something apparently marginal or trivial in the text be brought to the center of attention? So we'll do that with these songs. So let's focus on Boy George and Culture Club, Karma Chameleon. I'll walk you through the intros and the bodies, and then I'll walk you through the intro and the bodies for the safety dance. And you should have a good understanding of how my students wove their new critical and deconstructive reads into the scaffold and the sort of the training wheel structure of my templates. So the first question is this: how do I write the introduction? And as always, I tell my students, you got two options: declare or invert the thesis. But here's the kicker, and for those of you that are familiar with my work, you know what I'm talking about here. For literary analysis, so for all three FRQs on the AP Literature exam, I tell my students to invert the thesis. It really ensures that they're going to perform literary analysis and not, hit the snafu or, crash into the pitfall of writing plot summary. So having something that reads like a Cliff Note summation. It really ensures that they meet the demands of the assignment. So I'll give a cursory overview of the declarative, which we use for rhetorical analysis, and then it's a 50-50 split when it comes time for argument, persuasion, and synthesis research. Students can either declare or invert for those expository modes. So as always, you got to Bob Ross your instruction for this to happen. So what I would do for my students is I would choose some songs that they did not analyze and say, hey, here are like 3 inverted theses. 1, 2, 3, talk them through it and say, all right, choose one of the songs that we analyzed together as a class. We either did a fishbowl, Socratic seminar, Harkness discussion, Plato's Plato discussion, whatever, to ascertain the meaning of the piece. And then I would have them write theirs off of my models. It really demystifies the process when you're using templates and modeling. And that's all that Bob Ross really did. He got to his canvas and his easel and he showed us how to do it every single time. So I always tell my teachers when I work with them, position yourself as the expert writer in the classroom and paint with your students. So show them how to manipulate these templates. So I've already alluded to this earlier, but let's come back to it. In any FRQ1 or FRQ2 prompt, implicit in the language are 2 questions. What is the authorial intent, and how does the author construct meaning? So what is the authorial intent and how does the author construct meaning? So if we operate from this vantage point, we can clearly see that the new critical and deconstructive reads are going to be favored in terms of getting to the heart of these questions. So in terms of the template, we have the declarative, which just means you begin with the thesis, right? So boom, start with the point. You sprinkle in some context and background without getting plot summative. I'm a big fan of tier 2 level vocabulary. It's an academic paper, so we want our students to have a certain caliber in their academic tone, in their academic diction. So by tier 2, I simply mean your average run-of-the-mill SAT caliber words. But I don't want them to overdo it, and I need for them to stay in their wheelhouse, not to sound contrived or pretentious. Smooth, sometimes even a little balance, a teeter-totter balance with the colloquial and the vernacular tied in with the tier 2 bodes well for that sophistication point. So my students have gone through my word study academy from day one. We do intensive vocab study in my class with AP and my on-level classes. Sentence constructs, in order to get the voice, the rhythm, and flow that's so integral to the sophistication point. My students have been taught that there's 12 different ways to cobble together a single sentence. So most struggling and emerging writers overuse the independent clause in the short, simple declarative sentence. So you get this rhythm that goes da 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 da, and it's very intrusive when we read that. So you should see my students manipulating their syntax in the hopes of getting good voice rhythm and flow. So a variety of syntactical maneuvers in order to achieve those things. And then 4 sentences. With my template for the introductory paragraph, it's always going to be 4 sentences long, no more, no less. But we're not doing declarative. Let's go back a slide. We're going to invert. When you answer the question, how does the author construct meaning? That's the thesis statement. And this is going to be sentence number 4 in the inverted, because when you invert, you end with the thesis. So we're going to answer this question last. The first 3 sentences of the introduction are going to be the context and background, and we're going to answer the question, what is the authorial intent? So it's 3 sentences, authorial intent, 1 sentence, construction of meaning. So let's see what that looks like in this diagram here. So again, you end with the thesis. How does the author construct meaning? Start with context and background. What is the authorial intent? So some teachers talk about universal truth, universal theme, the gist, the thesis. However you want to label that is up to your own accord. And what they do is just as they're funneling down, save that last question. How does the author construct meaning? For the 4th sentence. And as always with introductions and even throughout the entirety of the essay, focus on that academic diction, 4 sentences, and the sentence constructs. So I have 3 samples here that my students did, and each one is going to adhere to this template. So 3 plus 1. 3 authorial intent, 1 construction of meaning. And then we'll talk about the new critical and deconstructive reads in just a second. So you start with the universal truth. What is the authorial intent? Love intrinsically holds a lot of space for drama and contradictions. And that's kind of the whole gist of Boy George there. There's a whole lot of drama in there. Just like anything else that can be experienced through our temporal senses, love has a paradoxical duality to it that can baffle many who just so happen to get struck by a wayward Valentine arrow. But within these apparent clashes of opposites, many lovers have no idea if they are coming or going. They're just there in a moment, spinning in confusion. In the case of Karma Chameleon, the repetition and yin-yang nature of the diction has the narrator feeling split down the seams as he tries to figure out his lover's motives. So let's go to this 4th sentence here. Do you see how you drop your terms and devices? I always tell my students, go for like 2, no more than 3 of the most salient, germane, relevant terms in the piece, like the unifying pieces. And the repetition and that split diction is really key to Karma Chameleon. Well, look at what we're doing here. We're talking about paradoxical dualities. We're talking about comings and goings. And we're talking about the yin and yang nature of the diction. My friends, that's deconstruction and new criticism all day long. All right, so out of the gate, this student is off to a blazing start. Look at the vocab: intrinsically, contradictions, temporal senses, wayward, Valentine arrow for a little colloquial vernacular. Very, very good. This yin yang adds a nice colloquial to it. split down the seams, right? So teeter-totter balance that colloquial, the vernacular with the academic. And out of the gate, you got good voice, rhythm, flow, headed towards that sophistication point all day long. Note the sentence constructs. One of the things I advise my students to do is not parallel their sentences, especially in the introduction. So each sentence should be syntactically different than the one that precedes it. And this follows that rule. And again, it's 3, authorial intent, 1, construction of meaning every single time, and do a good new critical and deconstructive read. So I'm going to highlight this again. My students, in order to write like this, I Bob Ross the heck out of it. And then together as a class, we held a discussion where we tore apart the lyrics of Karma Chameleon and Safety Dance together. So they're not doing blind reads. I helped them. It's early in the academic year. So, once we get to like March, April, I need for them to be able to do this on their own. So I cease to be the Bob Ross of composition as of March 1st every year. They have to be independent because I can't go to the exam with them. And I'm not going to college with them, unfortunately. So they got to be independent, and it works every year. I usually can retire that role by March 1st. So here's student number 2 going to go 3 plus 1. Most people caught in the crosshairs of love will say that their partner simultaneously drives them nuts while also serving as a bedrock for solace and sanity. So look at the opposition. You start with the opposition, right? So new criticism, deconstruction, universal theme. In the end, as such, love is a total contradiction that somehow manages to balance itself out. So by saying contradiction, right, we're into the language of new criticism and deconstruction. But for many a lover, this seesaw oscillation between loves, comings and goings, can get rather perplexing. So we're at the 4th sentence, construction of meaning, drop the terms. These contradictory forces are explored in Karma Chameleon through the inherent paradoxes in the diction and the song's syntactical arrangements. So each time my students focus on 2 or 3 of the most salient terms, every single time. So this is executed the exact same way as number 1, and it's just as good, and you can see implicit in it are the new critical and deconstructive reads. And again, I find when students do reader response, it just tends to be very plot summative. I think that critical lens lends itself for plot summative statements, which I don't think bodes well when we situate kids on the rubric and score their work, no matter how dazzling their writing is. The read is just a little absent, little vacuous in terms of like having pith and substance to it. Student number 3, going to do the exact same thing, 3 plus 1. Given the dual nature of existence, do you see that? Use the language of new criticism and deconstruction. Given the dual nature of existence, everything must have its opposite. For there to be heaven, there must be hell. For there to be hot, there must be cold. For there to be up, there must be down. Nothing can exist without an opposite. So this is why there is phenomenal love and crappy love. And now we're at the 4th sentence. Karma Chameleon explores this tug and pull through its syntactical arrangements and inherent paradoxes. 2 terms every time, right? So drop the terms and devices in that 4th sentence, 3 sentences authorial intent. And this student asked me, can I say crappy in an essay? And I said, yeah, it's actually a very good word, and I think it helps with the sophistication. And you might disagree with me on that, but I think because the vocab is so high in other parts, you can drop a little colloquial, a little vernacular from time to time. You don't want to overdo it, but to contrast this duality between phenomenal love and crappy love, which is the whole thrux of the song, right? That's what Boy George is oscillating between, is his phenomenal love and then the crappy love, and it goes back and forth, Karma Chameleon. Right? I think it's expressed very well, but I know that some of you might not like that, but I think it's fair game. I think it's very good. So next question is, how do I write the body paragraphs? And as always, you proceed syllogistically. So some of you are familiar with my work, and I can bypass this and just give a cursory refresher as to what it is. And for those of you that are new to me, in my YouTube channel, I do several deep dives on the syllogistic method. So you can just backtrack and look at those videos to get kind of a historical overview and more instruction on inductive and deductive reasoning. So the syllogism, basically in a nutshell, derives from Aristotle. He ran a school called the Lyceum. And the rich aristocratic boys in town would go there to learn about polemics, oration, debate, word wrangling, wordsmithing. And they would often tussle with big, juicy questions, essential questions like, what is justice? And that's at the crux of the seminal text, Plato's Republic. And Aristotle, like us composition teachers, was really concerned about line of reasoning. When students argued, he noticed that some of them just did not have a cogent line of reasoning. So he wanted to develop a template. He called it a heuristic in order to house thinking. And one day he had his eureka moment and he said, aha, I got it. The really good thinkers, the kids that really crush their arguments, are going syllogistically. And all that means is when you go from premise, conclusion. So if I were to say premise 1, arsenic is deadly. Premise 2, my dog ate arsenic. Conclusion, my dog is going to die. You would say, Christian, that makes total sense. Like that's very, very logical. But oftentimes when our students write, they have a hodgepodge of this stuff going on. And if we look at College Board sample papers, most kids just present the second premise, and that's why it's so plot heavy. So in terms of making this fit into a template for the purposes of performing literary analysis, this is how I bend things. Premise 1 is going to be an argument containing the terms and devices. This always takes 3 sentences, and I'll model this for you a couple of times. I want the student's argument to remain central, and they say that on FRQ 1 on the Lang exam. They say it 3 times in the directions. Your argument must be central. Hey, we're doing expository writing. Expository writing is an act of argumentation. So I want my guys arguing. So I tell them to withhold giving, their quotes, withhold their paraphrasings until the 4th sentence so that you have a centralized argument. Second premise is going to be a teeter-totter balance of textual support between the quoting and paraphrasing, and then the conclusion of the paragraph, not the conclusion of the essay. The conclusion of the syllogistic body paragraph is where you throw your links, you keep the promise of the first premise, and you echo the thesis and the prompt. All of this takes 10 to 12 sentences. So those little itty bitty 4 or 5 sentence bagger paragraphs that students write just don't cut it. There's not enough textual support or analysis in there to really advance an argument. So I tell my students, shoot for 10, probably don't go over 12. Otherwise, you're going to, get discursive and digress and, probably bird walk and break your line of reasoning. So I keep it tight at 10 to 12. So let's take a look at the first 3 sentences. An argument containing the terms and devices. Students often ask, where do I start? And I always tell them, start where Boy George starts. Start at the beginning and methodically work your way through the song or the poem or the short story, whatever you're working on, and then cross weave when necessary. So you can interconnect things as necessary. So look how we drop the terms here and go kind of chronologically through the song. So you'll see my students begin with these transitional clauses like right from the onset. And this is going to be exactly the clause that is used in the second essay as well. Right from the onset, the narrator establishes the fact that love has a complex and paradoxical nature. So again, we're just going to use the terms of new criticism and deconstruction. Left to its own devices, love waxes and wanes, which can definitely baffle the love-struck individual. But couple this with a lover prone to gaslighting, and watch out, all bets are lost. So the gaslighting is really big in this song, and it's kind of thematic. So we have this new critical deconstructive component mixed with the theme. So this is what I mean by multitasking the first premise. Again, to break that 1 paragraph tone, 1 paragraph syntax, 1 paragraph diction, begin to see how the pieces hold hands with each other. Fourth sentence begins the second premise. And I tell my students, get quoting, get paraphrasing. So since you started with paradox and the complexity, then let's go there. Let's start there. Go in order. Immediately, the narrator touches upon the contradictory and sometimes bewildering nature of love by stating that he is desert loving in his lover's eyes all the way. All right, so now we gotta analyze that very contradictory statement. So look at how the student analyzes this. In theory, it is feasible for one to love a desert landscape ideologically, but in reality, it is tough to conceive of someone loving the harsh and cruel climate of a desert. A desert is a tough place to survive. Further, deserts are places of severe drought and thirst, a place where if one gets lost, they are destined to roast beneath the blazing sun and wither to die. Oddly, the narrator qualifies his love as being all the way in this inhabitable landscape, yet if he listens to his lover's lies, he's rendered into a man without conviction and a man who doesn't know. I love the sophistication of this last line. Look at how many quotes are in this last line. Holy diction analysis. That's really good. So you're going to see my students be able to do this, where they can multitask the second premise, where they can quote multiple times in one sentence. But get this, it sounds conversational. How does that happen? Well, one, they bracket as needed, so teach your kids how to bracket. But I tell my students there's a template for quoting, and I call it the 5-word rule. If a student places a minimum of 5 words in front of the quote and keeps the quote small, it should sound conversational. So you have front-loaded all these words before the quote, and then you drop the quote, keep the quote small, bracket as needed, and this is all really good. So you don't want to go on about the desert forever and ever and ever. You got to move on because you have other things that you promised in the first premise. So you got to be quick because you're housed at 10 to 12 sentences. So let's see where we go from this quote. While the speaker informs us that his partner comes and goes, he's in fact the one that is being rather shady. Clearly, he knows the gaslighting games he's playing, and he knows this with every ounce of his convictions. Even the regular enforced rhyme scheme supports this claim, right? So look at this. You can go into syntax even though you didn't promise it because you talked about the paradoxical nature, and the rhyme scheme adds to that paradoxical nature. So now we can check syntax off on our list. We got it. Sometimes love clicks, which is represented in the natural rhymes. And sometimes love just simply doesn't work, which is reflected in the forced rhyme. Now, this is really cool. Making meaning out of a rhyme scheme. How do you tie it to the universal truth or the universal theme of the piece? That's hard to do. And when we practice nonsense lyrics, kids gotta make meaning out of everything. And this is a really good read. It could be total BS, you know? Who knows? We would have to ask Boy George what his intention was. But it makes sense, and we can support it with the text. So we're all good. This is a really good, tight syntactical read. The refrain of Karma Chameleon is interesting if one considers the denotative value of each word. Karma, look at the syntax analysis here. Karma, a Sanskrit word that encapsulates a person's action, effect, and fate, suggests that good and bad actions yield a concomitant reality. Clearly, as the narrator plays the chameleon between good lover and bad lover, his hot and cold persona has the audacity to say that loving would be easy if his lover's colors were like his dreams. And again, when you get into duality in here, the hot and cold persona, right? You're into new critical and deconstructive reads. All right, we have plenty of support and analysis, but let's see if we have line of reasoning. Everything that we promised up top here in the first premise, do we have quotes and paraphrases for it? Yep. Did we bring in anything extraneous? Well, just a little sidekick of syntax, but that's tied to the paradox. So we're good. So nothing extraneous comes in. We did not get waylaid. We did not get discursive. Everything stayed focused. At the conclusion, we echo that thesis and link it all back to the prompt. The words don't match the actions, and this is why this karma chameleon is in such a tumultuous place. Given the contradictory and paradoxical nature of their interactions, it is not surprising to see this level of dysfunction. And the conclusion always just takes a couple of sentences, and then you're done, and you can move on. All of this took 12 sentences, right? Very cogent line of reasoning, but a very tight new critical and deconstructive read. So that might be baffling at first. It might be hard to teach your students how to do this. So let's see it again. What do I do next? Like if the student were to go on and let's say your assignment is to analyze a couple of songs, what do you do next? You bust out another syllogism and you invert the thesis again, right? You do the exact same thing. So with Men Without Hats, their song, The Safety Dance, I'll run you through 3 inverted introductions and 1 syllogistic body paragraph. So hopefully you can present this to your students and it'll make sense to them, or you could just show them my video and have them proceed through it. So how do I write the introduction? Again, we're going to invert, but we're going to answer these questions. What is the authorial intent and how does the author construct meaning? 3 + 1. So look at what my students are doing again. End with the thesis. How does the author construct meaning? 3 sentences, context and background. What is the authorial intent? Focus on that. Tier 2, manipulate those sentence constructs, exactly 4 sentences long. So let's see the 3 + 1 in this. Every anarchist is a peer pressuring bully and as a direct result, an impediment to safety. Like this gets kind of funny how they do this. We talked about, we analyzed this poem and broke it down and gave meaning to it through our discussion. And this is the route we went. So that's a good expression of the universal truth. And I love kind of the colloquial swagger that it has to it. Somehow and some way, it is these brash and ruthless individuals that find themselves in leadership positions. Ironically, however, it is these very same people that foster the collapse of societies. So we are 3 sentences in, 4th sentence, hit me with the lit terms. In The Safety Dance, such a person is depicted through his paradoxical characterization and confounding syntactical arrangements. So we're 4 for 4 here. Each student drops 2 terms, devices. Sometimes they'll go 3, but we don't want it to be a literary terms dumping ground. 3 sentences of universal truth, universal theme, 1 sentence construction of meaning. Student number 2 for The Safety Dance is likewise going to go 3 + 1. Historically speaking, absolute tyranny comes upon the heels of anarchistic uprisings. In fact, this is the essential storyline of every dystopian plotline. The altruistic rebel overthrowing the man only to become a worse version of that very same man. At face value, man need only abide by 1 rule, the golden rule. At the 4th sentence, hit me with the terms and devices. The Safety Dance, through the narrator's draconian characterization, depicts what happens when a culture defies all of the social norms and mores established to keep order. Right? So very good. Got characterization. We're focusing on the characterization, the syntax in these, doing new critical and deconstructive reads every single time. And this is how writing gets demystified. So you do this enough, right? You Bob Ross this enough for your students. They practice it enough times. The writing's going to get demystified and their reading is going to get really good when you give them prose and poetry. Even for longer pieces, they can transfer it over to that. So last introduction here, 3 + 1. Government ensures that the general citizenry will conduct themselves with a certain degree of prudence and level-headedness. Anarchy, on the other hand, throws caution to the wind. While some might think that a society without rules and laws would be very liberating, it is actually quite impractical. Men Without Hats explore this phenomenon through the maniacal characterization of their protagonist and his inherent proclivity for contradictions. So when we're focusing on this characterization, We have a very new critical deconstructive character, and then contradictions gets into the duality, the ambiguities, the tensions, the oppositions. So we've set our thesis up to perform a new critical deconstructive read throughout the rest of the paper in all 6 of the introductions that we looked at. So next question, same as what we did before. How do you write the body paragraphs? You're going to proceed syllogistically. So we're going to have a 3-sentence argument containing terms and devices that will comprise our first premise. Teeter-totter balance, the textual support in terms of the quoting and the paraphrasing. Conclusion, link, promise, echoes, 10 to 12 sentences. Look at how my student begins right from the onset, same as the last time, right? Show your reader that you have a chronology, that you have a sequence, and that you're going to go methodically through it. Drop your terms up here and multitask. Right from the onset, the narrator announces his intention to ransack the general system in place to keep order and civility. Like most historical leaders who wield power and hold onto it too tightly, he dupes his followers with double talk and convincing enough paradoxes. Playing upon the susceptible and impressionable whims of teens, the speaker gaslights the heck out of the prospective dancers in order to impose his will. So I didn't intend for this with these 2 songs that I chose, but both of them, my students said, holy cow, you have really, really, really interesting narrators here, protagonists. They're gaslighting the heck out of their audience. They're really manipulative. And that is true of the safety dance as well, just like Karma Chameleon. So you can see here we have promises that we're making. Right? We got to talk about the paradoxes. We're going to talk about that gaslighting nature, the double talking diction, right? We got to talk about all that stuff now. So we need quotes and paraphrases that are germane and linked to what we dropped in our promise. Otherwise, we're not going to have a line of reasoning. So start where you first dropped your terms, right? So we got to go into the contradictions, into the duality. Immediately, the title of the song gets nullified because it is encouraged to leave your friends behind because your friends don't dance, well, they're no friends of mine. All right, so 4th sentence, you immediately get into into quoting and paraphrasing. We quote, we analyze. Clearly, there's always safety in numbers, but in this case, the narrator is encouraging his audience to break commonly established rules in the name of rebellion. This is peer pressure and gaslighting all rolled into one. Like a dictator, the narrator speaks from both sides of his mouth to woo the minion into accepting his anarchistic agenda. Oddly enough, he informs the citizenry that we can go where we want to, a place where they will never find. And again, we're just using that 5-word rule here to have the smooth quote transitions. Bracket as needed. Quote, paraphrase, analyze. So we move on. Little do they know, but the world that is being created is perhaps more tyrannical than the one they currently reside. While it is feasible to leave the real world far behind, one must ask, what will replace this existence? Sure, a world without rules where we can go where we want to and act real rude and totally removed might sound real promising. One must truthfully acknowledge that a government's philosophy is its foundation. So again, this student multitasked the second premise. There's a couple quotes in one line. I really think that is some serious flexing for sophistication. A lot, I don't see that very often when I read anchor papers or just general writing that students produce on this exam. Clearly, a system whose sole rule is, as long as we abuse it, we never going to lose it, can't possibly thrive for long. All right, let's go back and do what we did for the Karma Chameleon. Did we keep our promise? Do we have quotes and paraphrases for everything that we promised up here? Absolutely yes. Did we go for a bird walk? Did we get waylaid? Did we break our promise? Did we bring anything extraneous into the frame? Nope. So in the end, 2 sentences, wrap it up. Back to the thesis, back to the prompt. This kind of thinking certainly is not a safety dance. In fact, it sounds reckless and dangerous. The bottom line is this. They can dance if they want to, but this new system is going to collapse as soon as it is erected. So, go back to kind of what we were talking about in the introduction. Vocab is up, sentence constructs are very flowing, 10, 12 sentences, keep that line of reasoning, 3-sentence first premise. Every single time students can do this, and you can see the template really nicely houses new critical and deconstructive reads. So it's perfect, really good template to use to house those reads. So here we are at the end. That was a long writing workshop. Thanks for sticking with me. If you want to try your hand at this and host your own writing workshop using these slides, just feel free to email me, teachingwritingcoach@gmail.com, and I will forward them to you. I would also love to collaborate with teachers and Bob Ross some samples, and this is something that I do all the time as a lead teacher with the National Writing Project. Work with teachers to create our Bob Ross samples. So if you have a really good song or set of songs and you want to co-author some things together, I'm always game for that, because in helping you, you're helping me create content, which is always cool. So speaking of NWP, I always have irons in the fire with the National Writing Project. At present, I'm offering my Teach It Right 5-week mastermind through them. So throughout the calendar year, for 5 consecutive weeks, we meet Sunday evening, 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And we meet for an hour, and we just go through my Word Study Academy, my Nuance Academy, my Teaching Line of Reasoning Academy. You get well versed in my templates, my Plato's Plato discussion, my alternative grading methods, the whole kit and caboodle we do during those 5 weeks. Here's the kicker. It's a 5-week, 5-hour course, but the National Writing Project will award you a completion badge of 10 hours. So those of you needing professional development, it's perfect for you. And then once a month, I host a special one-off. And it's, in November, I'm doing my alternative grading methods. December, I'm doing teaching line of reasoning. As we near the AP exams, I'm going to do AP strategies for success, where I show teachers how to write all 3 FRQs for Lang. And then I'll do a separate session for Lit, showing them how my templates can house all 3 FRQs for the AP literature exam. We'll do some on my Plato's Plato discussion modality. So every month we'll have something going on. You can check my webpage at www.teachinghowtowrite.com for more information. My webpage is pretty expansive and pretty in-depth, so there's tons of stuff there for you to take a look at. So hopefully you found this to be useful. It was a long one. So be happy teaching, happy writing.